I was delivering and installing machines. Since I was behind schedule, I decided to drive late to my next destination. There were no street lights and no other cars. At the peak of feeling like I was in the middle of nowhere, every single light on the dashboard of the truck lit up, and then it stalled. Now it's pitch black. I am stopped, and the truck isn't restarting. I shut everything down and started making phone calls. I looked up and saw something move in front of the truck. I finally got a hold of someone, and they told me it would be 2 to 3 hours before they could get a mechanic for me. So now I am sitting in silence. The only noise is the clicking the hazard lights are making, and I am staring out the windshield into a void of darkness when I see movement again. I threw on my high beams. The headlights caught 3 wolves snacking on something that looked like roadkill. I honked the horn, and they looked at me like they were irritated more than scared. The wolves more than likely weren't going to bother me, but it was spooky just knowing they were there. So I shut the lights off. I suddenly heard what I can only equate to a woman's scream of terror that sounded like it came from right behind the truck. Then something slammed into the side of the truck, hard enough to rock it. I turned every light on and laid on the horn. I was checking both mirrors, and the only thing I saw was a shadow bolt across the road. I also noticed the wolves were gone. From every nature documentary I've watched, the only time predators leave food is when there are bigger predators around. I could hear it thrashing around in the brush nearby, breaking sticks and what sounded to be logs. I basically had the steering wheel gripped, all the lights on, and was feverishly looking out the windows and through the mirrors to make sure nothing was around the immediate area of the truck. Finally, I saw some headlights through one of my mirrors. The noise stopped as the headlights approached. It was obviously the mechanic, pulled out in front of me. My headlights were shining on his truck. As his door opened to step out, we both heard the scream again, and the brush thrashing intensified. His door immediately closed, and my phone rang. He called my phone asking me what it was. He sounded more panicked than me. I had no clue what it was, and he had no clue what it was. So the mechanic called the police. 2 state police officers showed up. They lit that area up like it was a stadium. I finally stepped out of the truck for the first time since it all started. We heard that scream 3 more times while the mechanic was working on my truck. Thankfully, they were getting further away. The cops had no clue what it was either. They were kind of spooked too. The mechanic finally got my truck running, and I made it to my hotel for the night. On the side of the truck that was hit, there was an indentation about the size of a basketball, about 7 feet off the ground. I have no idea what it was. I probably never will. I do confidently know that I will never, ever drive through the Upper Peninsula at night again. I service fire equipment, so I drive a box truck. I was in rural northwest Pennsylvania, returning from a service call and heading towards the interstate to go home. On the way to this customer, I saw a small pickup truck on the interstate whose right rear tire was steadily deflating. A mile or so before my exit, they pulled off to the side. I didn't stop to see if they needed help and felt a little bad about it. As I drove down this dark, twisty road, I passed a Dodge Durango that was pulled over into a barn driveway. There was a person lying on the ground behind it, struggling with something. It looked like the guy was trying to change a tire or get the spare out from under the Durango. Remembering the pickup from earlier, I decided to turn around and see if he needed help. I pulled into the first driveway I saw, about 1 mile down the road, turned around and headed back. Halfway back, the Durango passed me, going the direction I had originally been headed. I got back to where I had seen the Durango, planning to turn around again, but as I swung into the driveway, my headlights caught a figure lying motionless in the snow. I stopped and jumped out just as the figure sat up. It was a woman, maybe in her 40s, in a thin, torn black skirt and top. Her hair was mussed, her eye was starting to swell. She had red marks on her throat, and her lip was bleeding. I helped her up, got her into my truck, and cranked up the heat. I had taken my jacket off, so I gave it to her, and she covered her torso and arms. She didn't want to say anything. Her throat was sore, and she was badly frightened. I called 911, and they dispatched a police car. I gave her a bottle of water, and she whispered, "Thank you," then sat with her head bowed and eyes closed. It took about 15 minutes for the police car to get there, and she stayed silent. As the car pulled in, she said, mostly to herself, "He's gonna arrest me." The trooper walked up and motioned me to exit, asked her if she needed an ambulance, but she declined, then asked me what had happened. I explained what I had seen. He wrote everything down, then talked to her for a few minutes. He helped her out of the truck and into his car. She quietly thanked me for coming back, because she thought that guy meant to kill her. As far as I know, she wasn't arrested. She was pretty beat up, and the trooper spoke and handled her as if she were the victim of an assault. It was almost certainly a transaction that had gone badly. I never found out what had happened. I watched the news outlets for that area for a while, but never found anything. My dad was a trucker for years. He was driving down a mountain in icy conditions, but they'd done a good job of salting the road, so he was doing all right. However, as he was coming down the last bit of slope, there was a bridge, and bridges are notorious for being icy, even when the rest of the road is dry. The moment he hit that bridge, his trailer started coming around. He could see it coming at him in the mirror. He said the rule is if your trailer passes 45 feet, you're fucked. No hope of recovery and hope for the best. Well, his trailer passed 45 feet, and as he looked up ahead, the road on the far side of the bridge was bone dry. He knew in that moment that he was dead, that as soon as he hit that dry pavement, all hell was going to break loose. He kept looking in his mirror and watching his trailer stuck out to the left and trying to find some way to save it, even though he knew he couldn't. But that dry spot was coming up quick. Only somehow, when he hit the dry road, everything just instantly straightened up like there had been no problem at all. He pulled off onto the shoulder and parked to cry his eyes out and thank all the powers in heaven and earth that he was still alive. I used to travel for work doing construction. My boss was driving, and I was passenger. We were on our way back home from Tennessee to Illinois, just leaving the mountains but still pretty much in the middle of nowhere. We notice a couple of dead deer on the road. These things are like exploded. My boss and I say something like, "That sucks. A semi must have been hauling and clipped a herd." We get to the top of a hill, and there are so many more dead, exploded deer. Possibly hundreds. Definitely dozens. They didn't look like they got hit by a semi. They looked like they had sticks of dynamite put into them and lit off. Semi-trucks had definitely been driving through because we didn't have to dodge any of the deer. My boss had been on the road a lot more years than I had. I asked him, "What the hell was that?" And he seemed just as lost as me. Said, "I have no fucking idea, and I'm not stopping to find out. That shit didn't make any sense." I still remember that horrible situation. I had a family member who was a trucker for a fireworks company in the 80s. They regularly had to make deliveries from the East Coast to Los Angeles. Shipping these things to California meant many drives through the open desert of the American Southwest. They have claimed to see tons of weird stuff out there, from glowing orbs to unexplained lights to weird animals in the dark. The desert has a way of messing with the human mind. But one night, a bunch of floating orbs on the horizon turned out to be legit. They saw a bunch of orange orbs crossing the highway a mile or so ahead. It turns out that a bunch of tumbleweeds had caught fire in a forest fire several miles away and were flying across the highway ahead. They had to drive down this open desert highway at night while being on the lookout for flaming tumbleweeds. Not really something you want to maneuver around when you are carrying fireworks in your trailer. After a long haul through the beautiful city of Melbourne, Ben pulled off for the night in a quiet stretch of the town. Being outside the city limits, he was surprised at the thick darkness that followed after flipping off his rig's lights for the evening. With no street lights, cars or trucks nearby, it seemed like the pitch black bled into the night sky. He felt lonely, but was accustomed to the solitude of his profession. After his evening ritual of locking the doors, closing the curtains, and checking his surroundings for any potential concerns, he made his way to bed. He rolled from side to side for several minutes, perplexed by the cold he felt despite the summer season. The chill made it difficult to sleep, and he became lost in thought concerning the events of the next day. Suddenly, the cabin light flooded the space in a pale yellow. Startled, Ben sat upright to discover that the passenger side door of his rig was open ever so slightly. Fear shot through him as his mind raced. There was no way the door was faulty. The truck was new and in pristine condition. Was this an intruder? Grabbing a pole used for tightening belts, Ben prepared to meet the invader but didn't move. Seconds seemed like hours as a delicate silence settled over the truck. Nothing. Mustering his courage, he arose from his bed, walked around the perimeter of the truck, and discovered no sign of anything. No footprints, no nearby homes, no vehicles. Just Ben and his truck. After uneasily returning to his bed, he fell into an undisturbed sleep. The next day, Ben woke, stretched, and parted the curtains. Gazing out of his window into the daylight, he froze. The hairs on his neck stood up. Immediately adjacent to his truck was an isolated cemetery. Without bothering to put on shoes or pants, Ben started his truck, stepped on the gas, and sped away from that lonely spot. We usually took extra toy shipments to various locations due to the holiday season. We got a call that one of our locations in rural Kentucky needed to restock their giant Spider-Man dolls. They knew I was a fast driver, so I was giving the last-minute late-night duty. I loaded my truck and headed out on the 265. It was around 3 a.m. when I started to have this eerie feeling. I chalked it up to just being tired and popped a couple of NoDoz. About 15 minutes later, the road started to fog up. I mean, more so than any other time before or since. It got to the point where I had to pull off to the side and wait. There wasn't any other cars on the road, and I was ahead of time, so I figured I could wait until it cleared up a bit. About 5 minutes of sitting still in silence, my truck goes dead. No lights, no engine, nothing. I try my CB but cannot get anyone on. I check my cell phone and there is no signal. As I'm sitting there contemplating my next move, I hear what sounds like a child crying. It slowly morphed into a woman crying, or at least that's what it sounded like to me. Now I'm a big man, 250 pounds, but I refuse to exit my cab. I did roll down my window and asked if anybody needed help. At that point, the crying stopped. Then I heard what sounded like a sinister laugh. At that point, I felt like the laughter was directed at me. I rolled up my window, and it seemed like the more scared I became, the louder the laugh went. Then as soon as it started, it stopped. And just like that, my truck started back up and the fog dissipated. I drove out of there like a bat out of hell. I get to the next truck stop and pull in. I run to the bathroom and pour water on my face and ask myself, did that really just happen? I go out to the diner and see this fella, red flanner, in blue jeans. I needed to know if anyone else experienced that too. I go up to him and say, "Excuse me, are you a fellow trucker? 'Cause I just had one hell of an experience." He says, "Not a trucker, but..." Was driving north through the mountains of Colorado towards Pueblo, and it was my first time dealing with anything like the Rocky Mountains, so I was taking it nice and slow with my hazards on and in the right lane. This was in the spring, and there wasn't much snow on the ground aside from a light dusting. I remember passing another truck pulled to the shoulder on my way up, nothing out of the ordinary. However, as I was heading down the mountain, which can be scary as shit in an 18-wheeler, I saw the same truck I passed earlier in the left-hand lane. Now being passed on the left going downhill in the Rocky Mountains by another tractor trailer is wild enough. But what really makes this story is this guy's trailer brakes were on fire. He was pulling a load, could tell because the trailer was sealed. And if you know anything about trucks, you know there's only so much braking you're supposed to do before they overheat. This guy's truck looked like a fucking comet as he sped down the mountain at what I thought was a surely to be deadly pace. I grabbed the microphone to the radio and called out to him, "Hey driver, your brakes are on fire. I mean literally on fire." After a few seconds of static, a rough and weathered sounding voice comes back over the speaker of my radio and says, "Cool as a cucumber, I know." And he disappeared around a curve. I never saw any wrecked truck, emergency crews. I did see a discarded fire extinguisher on the ground at the base of the mountain though. My first couple years I was a night driver, so it was hard to see things sometimes. But the one in PA was me trying to follow a flatbedder who was hauling serious but through the mountains. At one point I start to fall back because I can feel the van starting to lean. It wasn't long after that I reached down to take a swig off the handy monster I had, and I look up, and there's a guy standing off to the shoulder just outside the tree line wearing what appeared to be some type of soldier's uniform. He had a musket as well. As I approach, I can see him staring right at me, and then he starts walking back into the tree line still looking at me. Before he manages to make it through the trees, he disappears. Like literally vanishes in thin air. I had my windows down, and the air in the area got real cold. After about a mile, the air warmed up again. I had a really sad feeling come over me for a while afterward. Needless to say, I didn't stop for the rest of my shift. I stopped at an off-ramp to stretch out and take a breather. As I'm smoking, a little girl from some direction I couldn't figure out giggles and says, "Hi, mister." My initial reaction was, the fuck is a little kid doing out here at this time? So I talk back and say hi. She then responds with, "My mommy says you'll be okay. Don't worry." Now utterly confused, I ask her what she means. No response. Then suddenly I feel like somebody is standing next to me, but it doesn't feel negative or bad. Just feels like somebody is right there next to me. Since it didn't have a negative vibe to it, I just finished my cigarette and left. Later on down the road, I realized that I forgot to fuel up at my last stop when the warning light came on. So I scrambled to look at my GPS and find the nearest truck stop, I find one and set the course. As I roll up to the truck stop, my truck starts sputtering and I barely make it to the fuel line before the truck starts dying. I ran out of fuel right as I got on the fuel line. It wasn't until I was fueling up that it occurred to me what the hell happened at my last stop. My dad told me and my brothers this story when we were growing up, and it's always stuck with me. He drove trucks decades ago, before I was born and before labor laws around limits and brakes were more standard. I'm assuming it's different now. He'd fairly regularly accept calls that would extend his shift to where he was driving 24 to 36 hours or more without a break longer than a quick bathroom or fast food stop. One night, after having already driven a particularly long day, he noticed his eyes getting droopier and the whole rolled down the window and blast the music up. Thing didn't seem to be helping much. It was a rainy night on a pretty windy mountain road without a shoulder to pull over safely, so he started doing those logic games out loud to keep alert and awake. He was saying something to the effect of, "I just passed mile marker 146, so what time will it be when I reach 200? Then he closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and felt his head do the nod jerk thing, which woke him up with a gasp. He opened his eyes to see if he was driving straight toward mile marker 158, which would have sent his whole truck tumbling down a random-ass mountain ravine. He was able to correct the course safely back, but it was a matter of seconds between that reality and certain death. He insists to this day that he slept through 12 miles of windy mountain road going 60, only to wake up right at the last moment between life and death. The story usually ends with him tearing up, saying, "I don't know if there are angels, but I know there's something bigger going on in this universe than our human brains have been able to understand yet. If I wouldn't have woken up right when I did, you kids wouldn't be here today, and that's something that feels pretty close to spiritual." I saw a car stopped on the side of the highway. We hadn't seen a car for a while. It was 2 a.m. I commented to my buddy, "Per bastard." But as we passed the car, the lights came on, and it got back on the road. Odd timing. And then it was gaining on us. I told my friend to speed. He did. He sped more, and the car kept closing in. We were doing 120 miles per hour, and this guy was catching up to us. We saw an exit with a hotel, so we took it and drove right in front of the building, where it was well lit and we could see the front desk clerk. The car got off at exit 2. It drove into the hotel parking lot, then turned around and got back on the highway. I'll never know what that guy wanted from us. I'm fine with that remaining a mystery. I was driving through Montana headed east, and my company had miscalculated my mileage, so I requested an emergency fuel up. I got a response with the nearest gas station that I could get approved at. It wasn't exactly close, so I turned off the main highway and headed toward my stop. It's pitch black, there's no moon, no city light, and I haven't seen any headlights for about an hour. I'm cruising down the highway and I see something in the middle of the road at the furthest extent of my headlights, so I slow down, naturally, as I approach it. When I come to pass it, I get one good glance at it and slam on my brakes as I pass right in the middle of the highway. All I could think was, what did I just see? So I back up looking in my mirror until I see its red silhouette in my brake lights. I pull my brakes, put on my jacket and grab my flashlight and hop out. I walk to the back of my trailer and put my light on it, and there it was, a headless, skinless, mangled corpse. I froze and my jaw dropped. I didn't know what I was looking at. I just stood there, in the middle of the highway, in the cold, stagnant air. The only sound is the hum of my truck 50 feet back. watching the steam rise from this pile of meat. There was no fur, there was no clothing, just a fully intact rib cage with a mess of other miscellaneous bones attached by ligaments. I debated calling the police, as the rib cage looked big enough for someone my size, but I looked at my phone and had zero cell service. The nearest town was about 50 miles out. When I put my phone away, I flashed my light around, and standing at the end of the road were a handful of coyotes staring at me. Then they started coming through the fence and trotting my direction. I figured this is the part where I get back in the truck before I get into a situation, so I did, and continued on my way. I still to this day do not know if it was human or not. Whatever it was, and whatever had happened, I was almost a witness of. I convinced myself that it was more than likely a deer, and was hit by another truck like my own at highway speeds that would definitely do significant damage. But in retrospect, I've never seen roadkill missing its flesh before. My most common run is Vancouver to San Francisco. It's an easy trip most of the time with very little challenge involved. I tend to prefer driving into the night because there's less traffic. Of course, driving around in the middle of nowhere during witching hour means I've seen my share of things. But none of that stuff has ever scared me nearly as bad as the people you see walking along the shoulder of the road far from civilization. I noticed my first one on my junior run down south on the number 5. It was a lady in a blue summer dress, just strolling down the side of the highway underneath the full moon, not a care in the world. Now we were on a stretch that was miles and miles away from anything in either direction, and I was the first vehicle on the road that she'd likely seen since dusk. She didn't even look up to acknowledge me, though. Instead, she just kept on walking with a sort of vacant smile. I chalked it up to some hippie from the Oregon Trail, hopped up on something from a nearby campsite, and kept driving. But she was only the first. It's not every trip you spot them, but sometimes you see a few on a single go. It always struck me as strange because you never seem to see them during the day. Or maybe you do, but they don't stick out as much under the sun. Even so, once you know they're there, you'll start noticing the hell out of them whenever you're driving far from civilization in the dark. The other truckers call them moonwanders, but I prefer shoulder walkers since that's always where they are. Almost like trains on a track, they walk that little white line to wherever they're going. They're different shapes and sizes too. Men, women, tall, fat, ugly, pretty, just folks like you'd see anywhere. Sure, they're creepy, but for a long time I didn't pay them any mind beyond noticing them on occasion in the split second that they were visible as I cruised past. But one night a few months ago, I passed by what looked like an old lady. She was in a hospital gown and looked just like someone on death row. Sunken, given up on life sort of eyes, frizzy white hair, and pale skin. She was smiling just like her grandkids had called her name. Her pace was a slow shuffle along the shoulder, and just looking at her I could imagine the sound of her hospital slippers running just over top the gravelly road. I wanted to keep driving because, well, to be honest, she gave me the willies. But hell, she reminded me of my own sweet grandma, God rest her soul. So I brought my rig to a slow stop and, collecting up the flashlight I keep in my glove box, stepped out of the cab. I could hear her coming before I could see her as I'd driven a few meters ahead of her due to the long stop time. I could visualize her wrinkly feet in those hospital slippers, shuffling ever onward. Quickly I checked the Maps app on my phone and saw that the closest town to where we were was over 50 miles. No way this old lady was walking that. Putting my phone in my jeans, I held up my flashlight and started walking towards the sound of her footfalls. Hello? Ma'am. I called out, hoping that she would speak up. No such luck, just more scraping. My hairs were on edge now as I waited for her to enter into the dim light of my flashlight. I nearly cried out as the ghostly appearance came into view. Not because anything was different from before, just because she looked so much more sickly up close. "Ma'am, are you okay? You're in the middle of nowhere, you know?" She didn't say nothing, just kept smiling and moving steadily forward. Now my heart was beating hard. She's just senile. Senile, and she needs my help, I thought out loud. But my feet were frozen in place. They were going back to the truck, or they weren't moving at all. She was getting closer though, and as she reached within 10 feet or so, her wrinkled hands began to reach slowly up. Her fingers wiggled in my direction like a grandma reaching for her grandchild's face. She opened her mouth but didn't say anything, just grinned at me with pale gums. My legs gave out, and as I fell onto my side, she reached down for me with surprising speed and dexterity. Before I knew what was going on, she had her bony fingers around my ankles, and I was getting dragged down the road. Desperately, I pulled back, but her grip was superhuman, and the addition of my weight didn't seem to slow her walk in the least. She stared down at me with those beady, sunken eyes, mouth agape, and a smile. I kicked at her with all the fight I had in me and luckily connected with her jaw. To my horror, it was like kicking solid concrete. But luckily, she let go despite having no visible injury. I crawled backwards towards the middle of the road, and she kept walking down the shoulder. Her hands fell back down to her side, and her mouth closed into a tight-lipped smile. But her gaze stayed locked on mine as she slowly shuffled out of my flashlight's beam. I waited as the scraping bit by bit faded from my ears, and after what ended up being a half hour of stunned silence, I worked up the nerve to get up and go back to my rig. No sign of the lady, but when I climbed into my cab and sped down the highway, it didn't take long to catch up with her. Her eyes were still stuck on me. They probably had been the whole time as she walked away. The last I saw of her as I gunned it away was her thin, chapped, smirking lips. According to some other guys I know, I'm the first to try and interact with a shoulder walker, and if God is good, I'll be the last. Since then, I've seen plenty more, strolling down the highway in the pitch dark. I even saw a kid once, but there ain't no way I'm ever stopping again for them. And if you're smart, you won't neither. Since that night, the shoulder walkers are always looking right at me when I drive past, which they never used to do. Almost like since that old lady saw me, they all did. I'd hate to think what would have happened if I'd not managed to get free. But I can rest easy knowing I've put my warning out there in public. Maybe I'll save a few folks with this story. I was headed from Salt Lake City, Utah to Albuquerque, New Mexico late on a Friday evening. When I got to southern Utah and near the Arizona border, I had gotten tired enough to need to pull over and sleep. I took a county road off of some highway exit and was driving down it to pull off so that I could sleep without headlights interrupting me or getting woken up by a state trooper and being asked to move along. That can be pretty annoying, and as a person who sleeps in his car a fair amount on road trips to get a few hours before pushing on again, it's just uncomfortable to be woken up. Anyway, the following happened as I'm driving along this county road a few miles away from the highway at about 3 in the morning, and suddenly lights come on right behind me with a vehicle that is very close on my ass. It's a large Dodge truck with a light bar and 4 or 5 hella lights that are shining into my rear view, blinding me. I try to pull over so that they can get around, heart beating and very scared. They pull over behind me, so I take off and try to lose them. But I am in a shiny older Saturn sedan, and they are in a pickup truck with 4-wheel drive on a road they are familiar with. It becomes clear that I'm not going to be able to lose them. They're swerving behind me. They're trying to pull up beside me, and they're flicking their lights. This was a very scary experience. I thought it through and had no idea what road I pulled off of, so calling 911 wouldn't have helped me since I couldn't tell them where to show up to help me. Regardless, this emergency was happening now, and I needed to deal with it. It was a fight or flight situation, and my flight was not working. So, I decided to fight. I always travel with a small weapon of some kind, and what I had between my driver's side door and my seat was a very large hunting knife, so I pulled my e-brake suddenly and slammed to a stop. As soon as my car stopped moving, I got out and started running at the truck, terrified but yelling like I was just fucking insane and ready for battle. They were sliding to a stop behind me and actually almost hit my Saturn by the time that I was almost at their truck. They had thrown it in reverse and were backing up. I could see inside of their truck, and it looked like some teenagers on the bench seat. The look of fright on their faces made me more emboldened, and I roared and yelled and cussed as they spun around and took off. It occurred to me after that, while calming down from a really fucking terrifying experience, that they were just kids out having some fun on a weekend night in a rural area. But to me, it really felt like I was being attacked and maybe they were going to try to kill me. I still think back on it with a lot of fear, because it was just a helpless situation, and my only reaction that seemed appropriate was to try to at least hurt them before they killed me. So somewhere out there now, 10 years later, are a group of young adults in their mid-20s to late 20s who have a crazy story about some redneck who turned the tables on them and charged them with a knife while they were just having a little fun. I worked for a company that owned a Caterpillar bulldozer. It weighed over 100,000 pounds. They had to use a tractor from the 1980s with a drop trailer to move it off the property. Both were functional and as safe as they could be, but had seen better days. They asked me to deliver the bulldozer to another company, and I agreed. We loaded up the dozer, secured it to the trailer, and I was on my way. One of the intersections on this state route is notoriously bad. It's at the base of a hill, and if you're coming from the side the hill is on, you don't see the stoplight or traffic until you get over the peak of the hill. You still usually have plenty of room to stop. As I was approaching this intersection, my CB antenna lit up, and a guy was basically screaming into it for traffic at the peak of this hill to slow down. The problem was that my CB wasn't tuned, and I only caught about every third word. I let off the accelerator when I peaked the hill, mostly because I hated that intersection. I would have had plenty of time to stop, even with the road conditions if traffic was normal. Unfortunately, traffic was not normal. There was a fresh, pretty bad accident at the intersection, and traffic had backed more than halfway up the hill. The accident had just occurred, so there were no emergency services on scene. I now had very little space to stop a very heavy load with a very old truck. I started downshifting and braking, realized I was going to be cutting it very close, and started braking harder. Then I realized I was hitting large ice patches on the road. The tires were slipping and jerking the tractor around. I heard the fifth wheel clanking, and I felt the trailer tugging on the tractor in a weird way. So I looked at my driver's side mirror and didn't see anything, including the dozer. In a panic, I whipped my head around to look out the passenger mirror, and the only thing I saw was the entire side profile of the trailer and dozer. I had made a terrible mistake in letting that trailer get out from behind me. This is it. This is how I die. Moments. I was now jackknifing, while still moving, and still trying to slow the truck down while on an icy hill. I was headed for an intersection full of stopped passenger cars, and my truck weighed a lot. By this point, I was thoroughly convinced that I was about to involuntarily murder a bunch of people. I laid on the horn as much as I could, but I was also trying to work the steering wheel in an attempt to pretend I had control. Honestly, I hit a point where I basically realized I was just a passenger standing on a brake pedal. I didn't have enough room to correct anything, so I just went all out on the horn. The trailer tires finally heated up enough to start making a very loud and deep squeal. There were a bunch of people in front of me that got out and ran away from their cars. They were basically staring at out-of-control death coming down the hill. The truck finally came to a stop within 3 feet of the last car in the intersection. I could sit on my truck's bumper and easily put my feet up on the car's bumper. The truck stopped with the trailer jackknifed, so I was blocking both lanes and the breakdown lane. I was sweating and was shaking from the anxiety. As I was sitting in the now-stopped truck, the people who had abandoned their cars were now screaming at me and pointing up the hill. I looked up the hill to see another tractor, but a tank trailer, basically reliving everything I just had, with much less space to work with due to my trailer blocking so much of the road. I got out of my truck and ran away from it. The second truck slid down, stopped and parallel parked almost perfectly with my truck. Once his truck stopped, I could see he was experiencing the same thing I was. We were both extremely close to being in bad accidents. Thankfully, he was pulling a dry tank. I am pretty sure that's the only reason he was able to stop. He was running much lighter than me. By this time, the guy on the CB got through to enough truckers at the top of the hill that they basically slowed everyone down. Once the adrenaline wore off, I almost passed out. I have operated a lot of different vehicles in my life, and that situation was easily the scariest operating situation I have ever lived. I had zero control of the situation, and that's a bad feeling for an operator. I remember the people that ran away from their cars were comforting me. It's been over 20 years since that happened, and I still get the willies when I think about it. Had I not been able to get that truck to stop, I would have ripped through all those passenger vehicles with little resistance. Another 5 miles per hour, or being in a different lane, just a bit more ice, even the time of day would have completely changed the outcome of that situation. It would have been entirely my fault,